judge a book by its cover. That's what we are taught as children, and it is drummed into us that we are all equal no matter what our race, sex, or religion is. So why is it any different for gender identity and for individuals who identify as part of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender diverse, intersex, queer, asexual, and questioning community? Youth of today's society who identify as LGBTIQ encounter discrimination in their day-to-day lives. So could you imagine the difficulties of these youth in the Australian juvenile system? Are they truly locked in the closet? Today I will start by looking at the data that is known around the Australian juvenile system, followed by looking at the discrimination that they may encounter through looking at international data which supports my findings. I will then transition into looking at discrimination that the LGBTIQ community encounter and how this is then exacerbated in their experience in the juvenile justice system. I will conclude by identifying specific gaps in the research and by looking at issues that require further investigation, followed by proposing a research question and anticipated difficulties around the area. In a study conducted by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare from June 2015 to June 2019, it was found that on a given night there was around 949 youth in detention around Australian states. 90% of these youth were male, with 83% of them being aged between 10 to 17. These statistics become concerning when we are talking about the youth of Australia. They are drastically high, and what is even more interesting is that there is no data showing any statistics around the LGBTIQ community that would also be part of these incarcerated youth. In Australia, primarily the youth justice system is focused on the processes and practices of young people who have committed or allegedly committed offences, with slight variations amongst states and territories, as each state has its own legislation, policies and practices. For this reason, the two graphs here show us that, yes, in terms of average nightly population, the graph on the left shows New South Wales with the highest number of youth incarcerated. However, the graph on the right shows the average rate per 10,000 of incarcerated youth are in the Northern Territory, which is very interesting because the Northern Territory would have such a low population in comparison to the rest of Australia, yet it is almost 3 times higher than all other states. It is well known that the LGBTIQ youth have difficulties in their everyday lives, which make it difficult for them to be their true selves, and because of this, it is understandable that the discrimination they encounter in the juvenile justice system is drastic. Through international studies, it is evident that the LGBTIQ youth have always been present in the juvenile justice system. However, they tend to conceal their identities to escape harassment and mistreatment. For many years, the issue has just largely been denied, ignored, or dismissed, and for this reason it is difficult to say exactly how many are in the system today. But one study suggests that at least 13% of the entire detained population in the juvenile justice system identify as part of the LGBTIQ community. For this reason, there is a need for rapid cultural change. A theory that should be considered around this area of discrimination is the idea of multidimensionality. It is a concept that reveals a diverse range of harms that can be caused by the interconnectedness of racism, sexism, poverty, and heterosexism. It is the thought that to understand someone, we need to know where they come from and all that identifies them before addressing their needs. This is a crucial starting point to addressing a process of change in the juvenile justice system. Taking this theory into account, it can then be applied in examining the experience of the LGBTIQ youth community in the juvenile justice system, and it will allow for a greater understanding of experiences and as such provide a pathway for change. There are several different legislative frameworks that are put in place to protect human rights of all, but While there is a range of applicable frameworks, particular to this current study on the juvenile justice system is the Sex Discrimination Act 1984. This act states that persons should not be discriminated against on the grounds of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or intersex status. Given this legislative framework is in place, do LGBTIQ youth in the juvenile justice system experience discrimination of this kind in Australia, particularly when there is international evidence showing they do experience discrimination? From the international research, it is evident that many LGBTIQ youth in the juvenile justice system live in a system where their sexual identity is a cause for further harassment and punishment, and as such, there is a need for a catalyst of change. For too long, these issues have been overlooked, ignored, and mistreated, and a stand needs to be made against the discriminatory treatment of LGBTIQ children in this system. Over the years, advocates have come to provide avenues for reform, creating non-discriminatory policies and best practice guidelines to bring about change, but the problem remains. It is time these youth are given the voice that they need to speak up against this discrimination, which may be the first time any of them have had this chance. As such, it is clear there has been a major gap in the research of this issue at an Australian level, and this needs to be investigated to assess the issue and bring about reform. Past research in this area has focused on obtaining data and information through such things as literature reviews, ethnographic research, interviewing, and questionnaire techniques. While these are most likely the best way to access such data, and they will provide valid and reliable data, the anticipated difficulty that will be encountered is the access to the juvenile facilities. With the lack of individuals in the system that identify as part of the LGBTIQ community, imaginably, there is likely to be a high lack of willingness to participate and divulge any information in the fear of encountering further harassment or discrimination. To conclude, my research has led to the goal of developing further research that firstly looks at the general discrimination experiences of the LGBTIQ communities in Australia, and then assessing if they do experience this discrimination in the juvenile justice system, despite the implementation of legislative frameworks. By looking at international research which suggests they do experience discrimination. From this, if there is evidence that LGBTIQ youth are experiencing discrimination in the juvenile justice system in Australia, then there is a need to develop a pathway to reform. To conclude,